Hello, my name is Marianne and I'm an alcoholic. I'd like to welcome you to Recovery in Action, Life on Life's Terms. This is an open meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous. We're glad you're all here, especially newcomers. In keeping with our singleness of purpose and our third tradition, which states that the only requirement for AA membership is a desire to stop drinking, we ask that all who participate confine their discussion to their problems with alcohol. This is an open Big Book step study meeting where we discuss the 12 steps of recovery as they're written in the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous, with the focus on their application in everyday life in recovery. This is the fourth session of the sixth cycle of the workshop that was presented on May 18th, 2024, where we completed the resentment inventory portion of step 4. Next week we'll continue with step 4 and begin the fears inventory. If you would like to contribute to the seventh tradition, you may do so using the QR codes displayed. Contributions are applied towards the group's expenses and support our service offices. Recordings of the workshop are available, and if you would like to be placed on the distribution list, please send an email to recoveryinaction462@gmail.com to receive the links. These links are unlisted and not public. I request that you not share them at the public level or post on any social media sites. The workshop typically begins with a brief meditation in which an inspirational music video is played. Because of copyright restrictions, it cannot be on the video. However, a link is provided, and I suggest you take a minute, view the video, and take a brief meditation for yourself before you begin the workshop. As the recording begins, the workshop is already in session. Please feel free to contact me if you have any additional questions or require my assistance further. I hope you enjoy the workshop. Another custom of this group is to start the workshop by saying the full version of the Serenity Prayer. We're all familiar with the first part, but many of us are unaware that there is a second part to it, and I believe it's this second part of the prayer that reflects what recovery is all about. So if you would all please join me in the Serenity Prayer. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Living one day at a time, enjoying one moment at a time, accepting hardship as the pathway to peace, taking as he did this sinful world as it is, not as I would have it, trusting that he will make all things right if I surrender to his will, that I may be reasonably happy in this life and supremely happy with him forever in the next. Amen. When we talk about really applying all of this, we're talking about how we recover from alcoholism. And the way we start is looking at the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous, which is the book of instructions on how to work the 12 steps. And the 12 steps are the set of instructions on how to get rid of the things that are blocking us off from our higher power, how to get connected to God, and how to stay surrendered from alcohol making our life unmanageable. And we need to be aware that merely reading the book without doing what the book says is useless. It's just like reading the instructions on how to put together a piece of furniture from IKEA. I can read the instructions, but if I don't actually pick up the tools and put the pieces together, I'm not going to have the finished piece of furniture. It's the same way with the Big Book. Merely reading the instructions without doing what they say will not have us become recovered. We need to practice and practice and practice and practice. And that's what we're doing here, is we're looking at how the Big Book provides us with these instructions. And when we look at the Big Book, we're just going to extract some parts of it. So when we look at the cover page, it states that this is the story of how many thousands of men and women have recovered from alcoholism. And the definition of recovered is that the problem is removed, I don't have to make a choice as to whether I drink or not because I don't even think about it. I automatically turn to God instead of alcohol when I'm upset. It's no longer an option to solve my problems. Selfishness and self-centeredness are gone. I'm no longer angry, fearful, or harmful, and my old destructive ways of thinking and acting have been replaced by new and peaceful ones. And what happens here is that the definition of what is the 10th step promise from page 84 of the big book is now a way of life. And that 10th step promise is, and we have ceased fighting anything or anyone, even alcohol, for by this time sanity will have returned. We will seldom be interested in liquor. If tempted, we recoil from it as from a hot flame. We react sanely and normally, and we will find that this has happened automatically. We will see that our new attitude towards liquor has been given us without any thought or effort on our part. It just comes, and that's the miracle of it. We're not fighting it, neither are we avoiding temptation. We feel as though we've been placed in a position of neutrality, safe and protected. We've not even sworn off. Instead, the problem has been removed. It does not exist for us. We are neither cocky nor are we afraid. That's our experience. That's how we react so long as we keep in fit spiritual condition. And then when we go to page 27, it defines recovered as ideas, emotions, and attitudes, which were once the guiding forces of the lives of these men, are suddenly cast to one side, and a completely new set of conceptions and motives begin to dominate them. And then additionally, when we look into the appendix of the spiritual experience, it gives a definition of recovered as a personality change sufficient to bring about recovery from alcoholism has manifested itself among us in many different forms. And then the last thing we're going to look at is that in the foreword to the first edition, it states, we of Alcoholics Anonymous are more than 100 men and women who have recovered from a seemingly hopeless state of mind and body. To show other alcoholics precisely how we have recovered is the main purpose of this book. It later goes on to say that the only requirement for membership is an honest desire to stop drinking. However, the desire to stop drinking is not the only requirement to becoming recovered. There's other things involved, such as being willing and actually doing everything that the big book says to do. So that brings us to the first step. We admitted we were powerless over alcohol, that our lives had become unmanageable. And we covered the first step. And the one thing about the first step is the acknowledgement that, yes, I'm an alcoholic. It talks about self-knowledge. I need to know this about myself. And as a real alcoholic, the only thing that self-knowledge does is make me realize that I cannot take just one drink without being physically driven to take one drink after another. This then allows me the opportunity, if I'm spiritually fit, to pass on that first drink. And I can only do this on a continuous basis if I'm connected to my higher power. So therefore, I have to have some concept of a higher power. And the great thing about AA is that I'm the one who decides who and what that higher power is, which brings us to step 2, which we covered. Came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. So whatever my higher power happens to be, whatever that concept is for me, the only requirement that I have to do for step 2 is to answer yes to the question, do I now believe, or am I even willing to believe that there's a power greater than me that can solve my problem? Once I say yes to that, I am at step 3, made a decision. to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understood him. A very misunderstood step, because the only thing about step 3 that I have to do is make a decision. And that decision is to do the work that follows the 3rd step. So all I'm doing in step 3 is making the decision, which then brings me to step, and in step 3, we went through this. In step 3, we say the 3rd step prayer, which is, God, I offer myself to thee. And we went through an activity with this where we really looked at taking apart this 3rd step prayer. And what does this actually mean when I offer myself to God to build with me and do with me as thou wilt? What does it mean to be relieved of the bondage of self, that I may better do thy will? Take away my difficulties, that victory over them may bear witness to those I would help of thy power, thy love, and thy way of life. May I do thy will always. So what does this mean? What does it mean when I'm offering myself to God? When I make an offer of someone, I am putting myself at their service. So as I'm offering myself to God, the first part of beginning that service of offering myself to God is I need to know what I'm working with. I need to know what I'm offering. So this is where we're at step 4, made a searching and fearless moral inventory of ourselves. So again, this is taken directly from the big book, and it's done according to the instructions in the big book. Your commitment to doing these inventories is in direct proportion to how badly you want your life to change. So before starting step 4, I like to provide a little analogy of it, especially as alcoholics. We're often referred to as those big babies. As being very childish. So this should be very natural for us to think of ourselves as a 7-year-old kid. And as a 7-year-old kid, my mother tells me to go in and clean my room. Now, if your kids were anything like my kids, this is what their rooms look like. It's a mess. You don't know what's going to come crawling out from underneath the bed. So your mother tells you to go in and clean your room, and you do it, but you're not really happy about it. But instead of telling you to clean your room this time, your mother says to you to go through all of your things and put on your bed any clothes that don't fit you anymore or that you don't like anymore, any toys that you don't want or that you don't play with anymore, or anything that you think is yucky. Just going through all of your stuff and putting it on the bed and sorting it out, that's step 4. Then your mother comes in your room and you show your mother all the stuff you don't want anymore. That's step 5. Next, your mother asks you to make sure you don't want any of this stuff anymore, because you are sure, all of it's going to be put in the car and taken to the Salvation Army. Step 6. And then you go to the Salvation Army and you give away all the stuff that you don't want anymore. And after that, your mother takes you to the mall and buys you replacements for all of the things that you just gave away. That's step 7. And those replacements are things that you really want. They're great and they're better than what you had before. Step 7. So when we get into the 4th step, we're looking at these 4th step inventory forms. And if you're in the workbook, there are blank 4th step inventory forms in the back of the book, starting on page 184. But if you want to follow along with us, let me just get to the page. We're starting on, here we are on page 114 if you're if you're in the workbook and you can follow along. So for your fourth step inventories, there are 4 inventory forms. And in addition to this, there are also inventory forms on our Google Drive that you can download as a Word document if you're anything like me and you find it easier to actually type out the pages, or some people find it more helpful to write out. You could print copies of the pages, as many as you need, and then you can write on the forms. I left it that way because, again, some people prefer to type, other people prefer to write. Doesn't matter. However, you get it down there and get it out there. But there are 4 fourth step inventory forms. 1 for resentments, 1 for fears, and then 2 for harms. Harms that we've done to other people, just general harms in general, and then harms that have to do with our sex conduct. I don't know why Bill decided to separate them like that, but he did have a separate category for our sexual conduct. So we're starting with the resentment inventory. And we start with the resentments because typically our resentments are the things that really start us in really having bad feelings about people. So when we look at our resentment inventory, which starts in the big book on page 64, we listed the people, the institutions, or the principles with whom we were angry. So we've got people, we've got institutions, which might be things like the IRS, the municipal government, the corporation or the business that we work for. These are all institutions. And then there's principles. Principles are things like the 10 Commandments, things like that, that tell us things that we shouldn't be doing that we are doing. So these are principles. And these are things that we're angry about. How dare God tell me that I shouldn't steal things? How dare God tell me I shouldn't lie? These are all principles, but I do it all the time. So page 65 provides the example. And for our purposes, we're going to use this example directly from page 65 of the big book. And you can do this for yourself, either starting with a blank sheet of paper or a blank inventory form. But basically what you're doing is you're listing everybody that you're upset with. Everybody. It doesn't matter if the resentment or is big or small, as long as your peace of mind is disturbed by this person, their name is written down. And I heard an example one time where someone said, well, I don't really have any resentments towards people. And their sponsor said, oh, really? You don't have any resentment? No, I don't have any resentments towards anybody. I don't have any bad feelings towards anyone. He goes, okay, well, are there any people that you feel superior to? Oh, yeah. I think this one's stupid. I think that one's blah, 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 blah. There we've got some resentments. Now we're starting to see where we've got some resentments. So in the big book, we've got the names of Mr. Brown, Mrs. Jones, my employer, my wife. Now, obviously, the example here is of a male. And I'm going to we're just speculating who this might be. I'm going to say that this is a fictitious person. So we take some artistic license as we use these examples. And you'll see as I go through this, you're going to see how these resentments can come across. So the next instruction is on page 64, and it states, we asked ourselves why we were angry. And I just love this picture of this little kid with the, I can really relate to that because we wonder why we're angry. What is it at this person has done that makes us think that there should be a special place in hell for them? What is it about them? And therefore, the instructions for column 1 is that we take the first name from the list we just made and we add it to column 1 of the resentment inventory. Then in column 2, we list all the reasons why we're upset with this person, and we can put each one on a separate line or in a separate box. But when you're done listing all the resentments with this person, then you move on to the second name and you do the same thing. And you continue doing this same procedure until you're done with all the names listed. And the examples, again, are on page 65. So if we look at this, it's like, okay, I'm resentful at Mr. Brown. Now I know Howard Eber, and when he does his big book workshop, he has behind him, I don't remember, I think it's a t-shirt or a poster, and it says Mr. Brown needs his ass kicked, which I think is just great. But again, I'm resentful at Mr. Brown because of his attention to my wife. He had the nerve to tell my wife about my mistress, and Brown might get my job at the office. So we want this to be very succinct, no long descriptions, and definitely no justifications. Everything is just noun and verb. No emotions are attached to it, no justifications, no stories, no explanations. You just want to be very specific. So for example, you wouldn't put down that someone used you. Instead, you would put down how they used you, such as they borrowed money and didn't pay you back, or they lied to you to get you to do something that you didn't want to do. So then going back to this form, we already did Brown. Now we're looking at Mrs. Jones. Well, she's a nut. She snubbed me. She committed her husband for drinking, and he's my friend. Took my drinking buddy away from me. She's a gossip. She gossips about me. Next is my employer. Well, my employer is unreasonable, unjust, overbearing, threatens to fire me for drinking and padding my expense account. How dare he? And then my wife. She misunderstands and nags me. She likes Brown, and she wants the house put in her name. How dare? What is her problem? I work, I pay the mortgage. Why should she be putting the house in her name? Now, so this is what we're looking at, just who they are and what they did, nothing else. And the next instruction is now on pages 64 and 65, which states, in most cases, it was found that our self-esteem, our pocketbooks, our ambitions, our personal relations, including sex, were hurt or threatened. On our grudge list, we set opposite each name our injuries. Was it our self-esteem, our security, our ambitions, our personal or sex relations that had been interfered with? Which then brings us to the next column in the form. And that's where column 3 is used to show how what's in column 2 hurt, threatened, or interfered with me, the parts of self. And the parts of self are our self-esteem, how you feel about yourself, your pride, your pocketbook, your money, your finances, or anything of a material nature, your emotional security, how safe you feel in the world, your ambitions, your plans for the future, both immediate and down the road, and your personal relationships, how you interact with other people, and your sex relationships, your intimate relationships. So this is what it's going to look like. This is an example continuing from page 65 of the Big Book instructions for column 3. Now remember, there's no right or wrong answers, but what we did was we made this little grid. And you see at the top here, it affected, I'm resentful at Mr. Brown because they, and what did this affect about? How did this affect me? It affected my self-esteem, my pocketbook, my emotional security, my ambitions, my personal relationships, or my sex relationships. And you see here his attention to my wife, my sexual relationships. Told my wife about my mistress, my self-esteem, my sexual relationship, may get my job at the office, my self-esteem, my pocketbook, my ambitions. Here we are, we've got Mrs. Jones. She's a nut, she snubbed me. So this affected my self-esteem and my personal relationships. My employer being unreasonable, unjust, threatening to fire me affects my self-esteem, my pocketbook, my ambitions, and my wife misunderstands, nags my self-esteem, my personal relationships, my sex relationships. So what we do is we look at each one of these things that this person did and what part of self did it wound or harm. Yeah, I'm seeing these perceived harms of what these people have done to me. This is all about me. So I'm checking it off. And the thing about it is, the more check marks you have, the angrier you are. And I just checked off some of these, but I would say in some of these cases, probably some of these other categories apply as well. So the next instruction now is we turn to page 66, which states, we turn back to the list, for it held the key to the future. We were prepared to look at it from an entirely different angle. We began to see that the world and its people really dominated us. In that state, the wrongdoing of others, fancied or real, had the power to actually kill. How could we escape? Putting out of our minds the wrongs others had done, we resolutely looked for our own mistakes. And that brings us to the next part, showing the next column, column 4, which basically states what was my part. How did I get the ball rolling? Now I had to condense column 3 because we couldn't show all that stuff here. I didn't have enough room on the slide. So I kind of condensed that, but we know column 3 is talking about the parts of self. And now we're looking at column 4. How did I get the ball rolling? Now I will say that I took some artistic license in column 4 because this stuff is not in the big book. But my experience in going to meetings, we can only guess basically the things that our alcoholic friend from the big book did. So if we look at, okay, I'm resentful at Mr. Brown because of his attention to my wife. Well, what was my part? Well, I was drunk and I didn't come home from work and I stayed out all night. So now what I don't know is probably my wife was worried sick about me. So she called Brown and wanted to know, was he working late? What's going on? So Brown was concerned. He wanted to help. So he went out looking for me. Okay. Again, we're making this up. This is not in the book, but we can only speculate. So then Brown goes around looking for me, and then he sees my car parked at the motel where I'm shacked up with my girlfriend. So Brown tells my wife. But in column 4, I'm cheating on my wife. I'm shacked up in a motel with my girlfriend. Brown caught us. So now Brown might get my job at the office, but I was drunk on the job, and Brown had to take care of my client because I wasn't there. So my client called, they had a problem, and Brown took care of my client. So now Brown's looking good, I'm looking bad. So he might get my job at the office. So now I'm looking at, well, what did I do? Well, here I was with Brown. I was drunk. I didn't come home from work. I was cheating on my wife. Brown saw me, told my wife, and I was drunk at work. So that's my problem. This was where I was at fault with Brown. Now we're looking at Mrs. Jones. She's a nut. She snubbed me. She committed her husband for drinking, and he's my friend, and she's a gossip. She talks about me. Well, what did I do? Again, I'm speculating. Well, I was drinking with her husband one day at the house, and we were fooling around, and I accidentally broke her favorite table. So, and I was drunk. So next we looked at, we were looking at Mrs. Jones. I was fooling around with her husband. We were drunk, and I accidentally broke her favorite table. So therefore, that's why she's upset with me. Now, my employer is unreasonable, unjust, threatens to fire me for drinking. I'm padding my expense account, but I'm coming to work drunk. I'm disappearing for hours at a time. I go to lunch at 11:30. I come back at 3 o'clock, and I'm totally drunk. While I'm gone, my colleagues, Brown and everybody else, have to take care of my clients and pick up the slack. I'm padding my expense account, so I'm stealing from the company. Not only am I stealing money by padding my expense account, I'm stealing time because I'm not showing up. And when I am there, I'm drunk, so I'm useless anyway. I'm not reliable. I come to work late and I don't complete my work. And then my wife misunderstands and nags. She likes Brown. She wants a house put in her name. But I come home drunk every day if I show up at all. I cash my paycheck at the bar, and I spend the household money drinking. So she's worried we're going to lose the house and she's going to be destitute. So she wants to have some security. So column 4 is the difficult part of doing these steps, because we don't typically look at how we're responsible. It's much easier to blame others. And this is the column that starts to change the way we think. We're not beating ourselves up. We're only looking at how we got the ball rolling. What are the things that we did? So if we look at columns 2 and columns 2 and 4, this is what we're basically looking at. I have a resentment against Brown, Jones, my boss, my wife, but I'm looking at this resentment at the left and what I did on the right. So this is the column that indicates how we did it. The ego, the part of you that feeds on and maintains the illusion of power and control, has a slogan of its own. And that slogan is, it's not my fault, it's not my fault, it's not my fault. Whatever happens to you, the ego assures you it's not your fault. The fault, and there's always a fault, lies with others. Your spouse, your partner, your children, your parents, your boss, your colleagues, or perhaps some racial, political, or religious community other than your own. Step 4 silences the ego because it is your fault. Maybe not all your fault, but enough of your fault for you to begin to notice how you got the ball rolling. In the previous examples, our alcoholic friend got the ball rolling because he was drunk, he was unreliable, he was a thief and a cheat. That's what he did. So it's important to remember what we're looking at is, where was I at fault? What was it that I did? The important point about column 4 is that it is all about you. It doesn't matter what anyone else did. You find your part in it, whether it was something you did, said, thought, or did not do, say, did not think, or some action on your part. And you want to keep it simple and not beat yourself up over it. So you don't add more than you have. You want to keep it short and concise. You're looking for verbs that describe what you actually did that caused what happened in column 2. So you look for how you got the ball rolling. Now, there is a caveat to this, in that rarely there is an occasion where you did not have a part. So things like maybe you were molested as a child, or you were raped, or you were a crime victim, or your child was murdered, or your parents were alcoholics or drug addicts, and those sorts of things. In those kinds of instances, there are certain resources, we have to get certain help, but we have to look at what happened was not our fault, but sometimes the way we react to it can have negative implications on it. So we want to make sure that whenever there are those kinds of issues, that we get the appropriate help for it and not hold on to it. And that's where it can get a little bit touchy, because it wasn't your fault if you were a crime victim, or if you were molested as a child, or abused as a child. Those things were not your fault. You didn't do anything wrong. But when you're an adult and those things happened 40 years ago and you're still holding on to it, then that can cause problems in your life as an adult. So we do acknowledge that. We're not saying, oh, well, this was your fault. No, you were not at fault. Sometimes things do happen. But then what do we do with those things? So I always like to address that, because it can happen. So when we get into looking at column 4, we remember it all is all about you, how you got the ball rolling. And it should be something you did, said, or thought, or did not say, think, or do. And to check it, you're looking for cause and effect. And a good way to really make this make sense is kind of to do what we would call reverse the resentment. And you would reverse it. So for example, if we're looking at our resentment with Mr. Brown, all right, remember, I was drunk, I didn't come home from work, I stayed out all night, I was cheating on my wife, and I was drunk at the job. Now, if I had been sober and come home from work, I would not have been having an affair. I would not have been drunk on the job, and Mr. Brown would not be paying attention to my wife, telling her about a mistress, or being considered for my job at work. So if I was doing what I was supposed to be doing over here, Brown wouldn't have been doing what he was doing over here. Same thing with Mrs. Jones. Remember, she's a nut. She snubs me. She committed her husband. She's a gossip. Remember, I was drinking with her husband. I broke her table when I was drunk. Well, if I had been sober, I would not have been drinking with her husband or broken her table, and Mrs. Jones would not have snubbed me. So again, if I hadn't been doing this, Mrs. Jones wouldn't have done this. She wouldn't have had the opportunity. And with my employer, all right, remember, I'm drunk on the job. I'm padding my expense account. I'm not reliable. I come in late. I don't do my work. So if I didn't pad my expense account, if I was reliable, if I came to work on time and completed my work and didn't drink on the job, my boss wouldn't be threatening to fire me. So if I hadn't been doing these things, which again are my part, then my boss wouldn't have any reason to be doing these things. I wouldn't have the resentment. And the same thing with my wife. if I came directly home after work and was sober, did not stop at the bar and spend my paycheck, my wife would not misunderstand and nag me. So if I didn't do this, if I came home like I'm supposed to, if I contributed to the household like I'm supposed to, my wife wouldn't be doing this and I wouldn't be having these problems. So, now a warning here, you don't want to berate yourself about what you write in column 4, because all you're looking at is facts. And the fact is that you did what you did based on your character defects. When we get to column 5, you'll see that what you did in column 4 was all you could do at the time because a character defect came into play. And those character defects, they're a way of protecting ourselves. So just like you don't have to pay attention to which hand you brush your teeth with or how you actually brush your teeth, your character defects automatically come into play because we're so used to them. And column 5, when we get to it, will show you that you're not a bad person. All you are is someone who has character defects. And these character defects think that they're protecting those 6 parts of self. So what you want to do is you want to look at columns 2 and 4. And then remember, if I didn't do what's in column 4, then the person in column 1 wouldn't have done the action in column 2. Or if I didn't do what's in column 4, then the person in column 1 wouldn't have had the opportunity to do what they did in column 2. Or if I didn't do or think what's in column 4, then it wouldn't have mattered that the person in column 1 did whatever they did in column 2. So, and if what you wrote doesn't make sense, either what's in column 2 is not really what you're angry about, or column 4 is incorrect. So you want to keep working at it until it rings true for you. And that's what we're looking at, is really seeing where we were at fault, which then brings us to the next instruction, which is on page 67 in the big book, that states, where had we been selfish, dishonest, self-seeking, and frightened? Though a situation had not been entirely our fault, we tried to disregard the other person involved entirely. Where were we to blame? The inventory was ours, not the other man's. When we saw our faults, we listed them. We placed them before us in black and white. We admitted our wrongs honestly and we're willing to set these matters straight. And again, this is page 67 in the big book. Now, basically what this boils down to is 5 main character defects. And these 5 main character defects are: I'm selfish, I want to keep what I have, and I want things done my way. I'm dishonest, I'm a liar, a cheat, and a thief. I'm self-seeking, I want more than I have right now, and I'm frightened and I'm inconsiderate. So these are the main five character defects that we deal with. And then as we get into this deeper, we have a list of other character defects which kind of branch off from these character defects. And this is the additional character defects, and they are at the bottom of page 121 in the workbook, at the bottom of the page over here, page 121. So these are things like they fall under those main character defects, like being an approval seeker, or lustful, or disrespectful, entitled. Entitled would be part of fall underneath selfish, lazy, procrastinator, unethical, would also be, so they fall under, like, for example, unethical would fall under dishonest. So the next examples are going to show us how to do column 5, which has to do with the character defect that allowed me to do those things. And all of these examples follow on pages 122 through 126. The examples are in the workbook. So when we get to column 5, this is what it looks like. And again, I had to shrink down this part just to get it to fit on the slide. But column 5 addresses the character defects that allowed me to do my part. It was a character defect that let me do that. So was I selfish? Was I dishonest? Was I self-seeking? Was I frightened? Was I inconsiderate or other? And so you see here in this column, I put that we were looking at Mr. Brown. I'm jealous. So part of that is that's an additional character defect. So when we first look at Mr. Brown, in reviewing my resentment, what character defects allowed me to be drunk and not come home and stay out all night, which allowed Brown to pay attention to my wife? Well, I was selfish, I was frightened, I was inconsiderate, and I was jealous of Brown. Next, Brown might get my job at the office. Well, what character defect allowed me to be drunk on the job, which had Brown be considered for my job at the office, is, again, I'm frightened and I'm jealous. Then when we move over to the next one, we're looking at Mrs. Jones. What character defect allowed me to be drinking with her husband and to break her table when I'm drunk? Well, I was frightened, I was inconsiderate, and I was a people pleaser. I wanted Brown to like me. Excuse me, I wanted Mrs. Jones's husband to like me. Now we've got the employer. What was it? What character defects allowed me to be drunk on the job, pad my expense account, not be reliable, come in late, and not do my work? Well, I was selfish, I was dishonest, I was frightened, I was inconsiderate, and I was also entitled, unethical, irresponsible, undependable, unhelpful, and unreliable. And then next we look at the wife. What character defect allowed me to come home drunk every day and spend my paycheck at the bar? And I really gave him a laundry list here, but he was selfish, dishonest, self-seeking, frightened, inconsiderate, plus being thoughtless, irresponsible, disrespectful, procrastinator, rude, undependable, unhelpful, and unreliable. So, and then I have some additional charts that identify some of the character defects that allowed him to behave in such a way. And believe me, I put more examples here than would be in an actual inventory, only for illustrative purposes, to see how you could how you might be able to apply them. So the first one, what character defects? Again, I go into a little more detail in showing each one of these. Which character defects allowed him to get drunk and not come home and stay out all night? He was selfish, he wanted to drink, he was frightened, he was afraid of what his wife might say or do. He was inconsiderate. He didn't care that she was holding dinner or was worried about him, and he was jealous of Brown. What character defect allowed him to cheat on his wife? He was selfish. He only cared about himself and his desires. He was dishonest. He was lying to his wife. And we don't know this, but he may have been lying to his mistress. Maybe she didn't know he was married. We don't know. But he was still being dishonest. He was self-seeking. He wanted more than he had. He was frightened. He was afraid his wife would find out. He was inconsiderate. He only cared about himself and didn't care about the consequences his behavior might have brought upon his wife or his mistress. He was also promiscuous. He was engaging in risky sexual behavior. He was exposing his wife to the possibility of catching a venereal disease, which could have, some venereal diseases are fatal. And he was also lustful. So those are just some examples. Next, what character defects allowed him to be drunk on the job? Fear. He was afraid of getting caught and what Mr. Brown might say to his wife. Jealousy. He was jealous of Brown. What allowed him to get drunk with Mrs. Smith's husband and break her table? Fear. He was afraid that Smith wouldn't like him. He was inconsiderate. He didn't care about Mrs. Smith's property. People pleasing. He wanted Smith to like him. And then what allowed him to pad his expense account, be unreliable, and come into work late and not complete his work? Well, again, he was selfish. He only cared about himself and not that his boss and his colleagues were depending on him to be at work. He was dishonest. He thought that it was okay to steal from his employer, both in resources, time, and work performance. All of that is a form of stealing. If you're getting paid for time at work and you're not working, you're stealing from your employer. He was frightened. He was afraid his boss would fire him. He was self-seeking. He wanted more than he had. He was inconsiderate. He didn't care that his boss and his colleagues were depending on him and had to pick up his share of the workload. Again, he felt entitled. He felt he deserved the extra money from the expense account. He felt he deserved to be paid for time not spent at work or working, as well as he felt that he should be getting paid for work that he didn't produce. He was unethical, irresponsible, undependable, unhelpful, and unreliable. And I got one more. What allowed him to come home drunk every day and spend his paycheck at the bar? He was selfish. He only cared about himself and his desires. He was dishonest. He was lying to his wife and spending the household money drinking. He was self-seeking. He wanted more than he had. He was frightened because he was afraid of what his wife would say or do. He was inconsiderate. He only cared about himself and didn't care about the consequences his behavior brought upon his wife, family, and household. And some of the other character defects where he was thoughtless, irresponsible, disrespectful. He was a procrastinator, rude, undependable, unhelpful, and unreliable. So I know that's a lot of stuff, but I went into a lot of details because I wanted to be able to show the example of what this means. You probably wouldn't go into as much detail for your own inventory, but we're looking at character defects and we've got a lot of them. We all do. So when you fill in your column 5, remember, you're only looking at what you did in column 4. Only look at column 4 and ignore everything written in columns 1 through 3. Start by asking yourself if you did the action in column 4 because you were selfish, you wanted to keep what you had and you wanted things done your way. If that's the case, you put a check mark in the selfish column. Were you dishonest? Were you lying, cheating, stealing? Put a check mark in the dishonest column. If you were self-seeking, you wanted more than you have right now, you put a check mark in the self-seeking column. If you're frightened, put a check mark in the frightened column. If you're inconsiderate, put a check mark in the inconsiderate column. And then other. Look at that list of other character defects. And it's actually twice. It's in the workbook twice. It's at the bottom of 121, and it's also at the top of 122. I did that so you wouldn't have to flip back and forth between the pages. But you want to look at this list of other character defects and see if there are additional character defects that were involved. And if you found some other character defects, you add them to the column labeled other. And you want to keep this as simple as possible. Now, here's the reason for listing these more specific character defects. Bill mentions some of these in the big book. For example, on pages 61 and 62 of the big book, he lists mean, egotistical, indignant, self-pitying, self-centered, and self-delusional. Also, you'll see as we get into step 6 and 7, the instructions for these two steps include that we're ready to let God remove from us all the things that we have admitted are objectionable, and every single defective character which stands in the way of my usefulness to you and my fellows. While every character defect falls within the major 5 or a combination of them, it's better to be more specific. So, for example, people-pleasing is really being dishonest, self-seeking, and frightened all at the same time. But people-pleasing gives a more accurate description of what I'm actually doing. Another example might be my number 1 character defect might be being mean-spirited. In reality, that's being selfish and self-seeking, inconsiderate, and frightened all at the same time. But using the description of mean-spirited gives me the exact behavior that I have to look at when I get to step 7. So in reality, the same situations will repeat themselves because your character defects continue to play out the same way time after time. So, for example, if you're a people pleaser, you'll continually find yourself in situations where you agree to do things that you don't really want to do, give people things that you don't really want to give, or not stand up for yourself because you want people to like you. Then you continue to be unhappy and wonder, why does this always happen to me? Why me? Here we go again. Why does this always happen to me? It's like the faces change, but the situation is always the same because it happens again and again and again because our character defects continue to come into play. It's not the person listed in column 1 of your resentment inventory causing your unhappiness, but it's your character defects. So when we're continually being unhappy and wondering, what again, why is this happening again? It's because of our character defects. And as we progress through the steps, once we get to step 7, these character defects will start to diminish. And in step 10, they can be removed. And as a result, the problems caused by them vanish. So I think this is a good spot. Now we finished up going through the resentment inventory. Thank you so much for your participation. I hope you enjoyed the workshop, and if you have any questions, please feel free to contact me. And now, please join me in our closing prayer, which is St. Faustina's Prayer for Mercy. Eternal God, in whom mercy is endless and the treasury of compassion inexhaustible, look kindly upon us and increase your mercy in us, that in difficult moments we might not despair nor become despondent, but with great confidence submit ourselves to your holy will, which is love and mercy itself. Amen.